This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture. I'm your host, Erica Pearson. There are roads in Minnesota that only exist in the wintertime because they're routes across frozen lakes. We're going to explore them in today's episode. We're talking about this today because we received a question from Roman Goldstein. He recently moved to Minnetonka from Washington, D.C., and he's still getting used to the idea of walking out onto a frozen lake, let alone driving a truck across one.
One of the things that I read about was car racing on frozen lakes, and I just thought, that is wild. And then I remember seeing some infographic, maybe the DNR put it out, about like how thick the ice has to be to walk on, to drive on or whatever. And a relatively not so thick amount of ice can support a truck. It's just really, surprising to me.
So to make himself feel a little better, he wanted to know more about the science behind ice thickness and how strong it is. Thanks so much to Roman for that great question. I asked reporter Kim Hyatt to look into Roman's question because she reports on north central Minnesota, and she joins me now. Hi, Kim.
Hi, Erica. How are you?
Doing good. Thanks for being here. So I thought that you were the perfect person to work on this question because the second I saw it, I thought about your coverage of ice racing. So what is ice racing for those of us who've never been able to watch it?
I would describe it like NASCAR on ice, but with less fancy cars. It's typically like beat up cars, and yeah, they, race in heats, and there's different divisions, and it's a tradition in a lot of small towns, especially northern Minnesota. I know Superior, Wisconsin also does ice racing, but yeah, it's just like NASCAR, just with fewer bells and whistles, I guess.
And it turns out that he read your story about this small town Minnesota tradition as well, right?
Yeah, I was planning on mentioning that when diving into his question, and I thought it was so funny that he brought it up first. And so he was just really curious about how is it that you could go from 4 inches to walk on the ice and 8 inches to drive a car. And he's just like, that just seems like a really big jump. Like, how do we get from 4 to 8 inches? Like, if there's a big difference between a person and a vehicle, but there's not a big difference between 4 and 8 inches. So that was sort of the basis of his question.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it is sort of mind-boggling. I was curious, how did you get the idea for that story? Is it something you grew up watching?
Yeah, it's actually done in my hometown. Other small towns do it too, but in LaPorte, they've been doing it every Sunday for decades. I didn't religiously go every Sunday growing up, but I did on occasion hop in the back of a beat up car.
Oh, wow. So you've actually
Yeah.
been in the car. Wow.
Yeah, so
Okay.
it's, as you can imagine, a lot of adrenaline. You're going around a rink in beat up cars, and it's really loud from the engines, and there's just a lot of, people hooting and hollering. And so for that story that I did last winter, I did climb in the back of some cars again and was reminded how terrifying and thrilling it is. And we did crash a couple of times, but everyone was fine. So it's probably not for everyone, but I would recommend people giving it a try.
That makes sense. And how thick does the ice need to be for something like this?
So they require at least 18 inches of ice. And so as you can imagine, as the winters vary, it could be very, very cold, and we have warm winters, so they will cancel racing seasons if it's too warm and the ice isn't thick enough. And then sometimes the ice is so thick that it will actually freeze to the bottom of the lake, so the muck will come up between the cracks of ice, which sounds just like a total mess. But yeah, the thickness can vary a lot.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, so back to Roman's question about the science of ice. Where did you go first to answer this one?
As with a lot of outdoor related stories, I turned to the DNR.
That's the Department of Natural Resources.
Yep. And they actually have an ice safety coordinator. Her name is Kim Emery, and she just had a boatload of information about the science behind ice and how they come up with their guidelines. And so she taught me a lot that I didn't realize about ice.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And it's amazing that there's someone whose job is just to take care of this. But I actually feel sort of reassured by that.
Yeah, yeah.
What are some of the things that she talked about? What did you learn from her?
So the biggest thing that came up in our conversation was the basis of ice safety guidelines. So the DNR recommended minimum ice thickness chart says if it's less than 4 inches, you should stay off the ice. If there's 4 inches, you can walk on the ice. 5 to 7 inches for snowmobiles, 7 to 8 inches for side by side or ATVs, 9 to 12 inches for a car, and then we get up to, 13 to 17 inches for a truck and 20 plus inches for a heavy duty truck with a wheelhouse shelter.
What are some of the natural reasons behind this? Is it the way the ice forms itself?
Yeah, and again, the way that she explained it was just very simplified and easy to understand. And she talked about the bonds that ice crystals form, like they're holding hands. And as the colder it gets, they're forming a tighter bond. And the crystals almost sort of stack bricks on top of each other. Like it's like stacking bricks is the way that she described it. And I really appreciated the analogy because I'm like, oh, that makes sense. Like the colder it gets, the stronger ice is. And as it gets, warmer and melts, then those bonds weaken.
That's great. I think we should hear a little bit directly from Emery here. Let's hear from your interview.
So, the way I think about it is ice is a solid crystal. So it's, H2O, right? So it's two atoms, two hydrogen atoms, and one oxygen atom. And what happens when they get really cold is the molecules slow down and they lock into place and form a pattern, like a snowflake. And each water molecule forms hydrogen bonds with the four neighboring molecules, kind of like holding hands. As heat is withdrawn, the bonds grow stronger and become more robust. And they lock them into a place so they're more rigid and stable. But at the same time, these connections make wide open structure with lots of space in between the molecules. So in turn, this pattern makes ice hard, but because there's the space between the molecules, it's able to resist being squished, compressive strengths. So there's some give in it, right? So ice, as it gets thicker, its ability to hold the weight increases much faster than the thickness of the ice itself. And that's because more ice means there's more connections between the crystals. And it's reinforcing kind of this growing web, kind of like mortar between bricks. And then the strength builds up upon itself like stacking bricks.
And then she got into the weeds a little bit in describing this formula that was developed in 1971. And it was used to determine how thick ice should be for logging trucks to travel on Canadian ice roads for the paper and pulp mills.
So tell me about this formula. What is it?
So it's Lorne Gould's formula. It was developed in 1971, and it's P equals AH squared. So P is the load, H is the ice thickness, and A is the coefficient, which is commonly 54 pounds per inch.
Got it. So why does the strength of the ice increase exponentially like this?
Yeah, it was easy to understand after hearing from Kim and this formula because it means that when you're doubling the thickness of ice, it's actually quadrupling the load it can hold. So going back to Roman's question, it's like, how do we go from 4 to 8 inches and you can hold that much from a person to a car? And then you look at this formula and you're like, oh, okay, this makes sense.
Oh, that does make sense. That does make sense. And what are some of the variables that then come into play as it's melting or in real life that can kind of mess with this formula or tweak it a little bit?
Right, because like a formula looks good on paper, but then we're out in nature, right?
Yeah.
So there's things that are not within our control. There are natural variables like beaver dams and vegetation, springs and canals. You know, if there's a river nearby, then there's going to be open water there, and the flows underneath the ice can factor in, as well as human-made variables like access points and bridges are some human-made variables. So there's often like thin ice signs near access points because of a lot of activity nearby. Energy plants can also factor into this, and auger holes.
Got it. Yeah, the people fishing themselves. Got it. That makes sense.
And I should mention too that there's, temperature and currents, snow cover, traffic volume, and flooding. Those all factor into the bearing capacity of ice.
That makes sense. So this formula was developed for Canadian ice roads, but Minnesota has our own ice roads too, and you were able to talk to someone who plows one of the most well-known. We're going to get into that after the break. Okay, so you talked to a man named Brian Ney, and every winter he plows a 25-mile road on Lake of the Woods, which is way up north, so far that it's partly in Minnesota and part in Canada. Can you tell me a little bit about him and what he does?
Yeah, so his family has owned this resort on Lake of the Woods his whole life. And when I was asking him, like, how big is this road? And he said 25 miles. I was totally mind blown by that. Like, I was picturing, just a short distance, to connect the resort to different fish houses. But 25 miles is like a considerable length to maintain that, especially when you're out in the wide open. But he described what it's like up there right now. There's about a foot of standing water on parts of Lake of the Woods right now, which looks really scary to people who aren't used to that. But there's still, 3 feet of ice. So,
Wow.
um, standing water does make it appear scary, but it can be a little deceiving, I guess. So people are still out there fishing.
That's really interesting, and I'm imagining the trucks like picking up all of this water as they're driving. So what are some of the things that he watches out for?
Brian and other anglers I spoke to, along with the sheriff who lives up in this area, all describe this term called honeycomb, which I hadn't heard before, at least in the and when we're talking about ice. And so they said this time of year they're really looking out for when the ice begins to honeycomb, which is when you put the auger in the ice and when it comes up, it's in chunks instead of ice
Huh.
shavings. And I actually went out ice fishing last night and used an auger for the first time ever, which was very powerful. And I was nervous though because my fishing guide noted that it wasn't the best looking ice that was beginning to honeycomb. And I was like, I just learned about this and this is not safe. But we were still on 24 inches of ice, so we were fine.
How do people know when the ice is unsafe?
So they can keep an eye out for the honeycomb, which is, specific to ice fishing. Not everyone has an auger with them to check for when ice is honeycombing. And so I would just be mindful of what it looks like along the shoreline because that's where it gets the most dangerous. That's where the ice starts to melt first. So I would be careful if the ice looks a little iffy along the shoreline and you can't really walk out safely. That's a sign that maybe you probably shouldn't go out.
That makes sense. So this time of year, as everything starts to melt, the DNR gives deadlines for anglers to bring in their fish houses. I know it's different all around the state. Where are we at?
Yeah, so as you can imagine, it gets warmer in the southern half of the state first, and so they have earlier fish house deadlines, and we passed that on March 2nd, and then northern Minnesota had their deadline on March 12th, and then border lakes like Lake of the Woods, they still have until March 31st, and so that deadline means that you can't leave your fish house out on the lake overnight, unattended. So you can still bring a fish house out past deadline, but you just can't leave it overnight. It's just a safety precaution.
Got it. That makes sense. I didn't realize that. So all of these deadlines are coming as we're watching for what's known as ice out in all of these lakes. What's that process like?
So when a lake is completely free of ice, that's what we refer to as ice out, which obviously has taken on new meaning in Minnesota in recent months. But that has been a term long used to determine when a lake is ready for boating season, basically. And the DNR, because they do not say when a lake is safe enough, it has enough ice thickness, that's up to each person to determine that, sort of like a no lifeguard swim at your own risk. And as with ice out too, it's reported by citizen observers. So the DNR doesn't make those calls or determinations. It's people who are watching a lake, slowly lose all the ice, and then they can claim ice out when all the ice is gone.
Yeah, that is so interesting. Well, thank you so much, Kim. This has been great.
Thank you very much, Erica.
And thanks so much to Roman Goldstein, who was curious about the science behind lake ice. You can read all of our Curious Minnesota stories online at startribune.com. And if you have feedback for us or a question, especially a question that you'd like for us to answer, send a note to curious@startribune.com.